A royal guard was escorting a fallen soldier through an airport when security stepped in, insisting he take the service corridor as if he were just another delivery man. At first, he said nothing, just kept marching, eyes forward, honouring the man he was there to bring home. But when the supervisor reached out and brushed the flag on the casket, the guard took one silent step forward, and what happened next brought the entire terminal to a standstill. Before we reveal it, tap that subscribe button and comment below where you're watching from. Now let's get into the story. The afternoon air outside Heathrow's Terminal 3 felt heavy with something you couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the weight of ceremony, or maybe it was just the London sky threatening rain again. Either way, Colour Sergeant Ellis Hart knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary day the moment that cargo bay door rolled open. Inside sat a single casket, draped in the Union Jack, looking impossibly small against the vast metal interior of the transport plane. No crowds gathered to watch. No photographers waited with cameras ready. Just Hart and 4 other servicemen, standing at attention in the kind of silence that speaks louder than any bugle call ever could. Hart stepped forward first, his red tunic pristine despite the journey from base. At 38, he'd done this before, escorted dignitaries, ceremonial duties, the whole parade ground routine. But this felt different, personal. The bearskin cap cast its familiar shadow over his weathered face, but his eyes held something deeper than just professional duty. The soldier they were carrying home was Captain Rhys Mallory, killed 3 weeks ago in Syria. 31 years old, just like Hart had been when he'd first met the kid's father. Major Alan Mallory, retired now, but still every inch the soldier he'd been 20 years ago when he'd taken a young Hart under his wing at Sandhurst. Hart remembered their first meeting clearly. He'd been a cocky second lieutenant fresh out of training, convinced he knew everything about being a soldier. Mallory had been his company commander then, the kind of officer who could dress you down with a look, but would also sit with you in the mess hall when you got word from home that your girlfriend had moved on or your father was sick. The uniform doesn't make you special, Hart, Mallory had told him during one of those formative conversations that shape a young soldier's career. It's what you do while wearing it that counts. And sometimes the most important thing you'll ever do won't be on a battlefield. It'll be in a quiet moment when someone needs you to remember they mattered. Years later, during Hart's promotion ceremony, Mallory had pulled him aside with that characteristic half smile that meant he was about to say something important. "If anything ever happens to my boy," Alan had said, glancing across the room where young Rhys was talking with the other officers' children, already showing signs of the soldier he'd become, "promise me you'll bring him home right. Not just home, but right." Hart had nodded then, the way you do when someone's asking for a promise you never think you'll have to keep. It was the kind of vow soldiers make to each other in the margins of their service. Insurance policies written in honour and sealed with understanding. Now here he was, 20 years later, keeping it in the most public way possible. The other guards fell into position without a word, 2 more from the Coldstream Company, 2 from the RAF. They'd done this drill 100 times, but muscle memory couldn't prepare you for the weight of carrying someone who'd never walk again. The handles felt solid under Hart's gloves as they lifted in perfect unison, turning toward the terminal entrance with the kind of precision that comes from decades of training. Inside Terminal 3, the usual chaos of international travel hummed along at full volume. Announcements echoed overhead in 3 languages, children complained about delayed flights, and somewhere a coffee machine was grinding away like it was personally offended by the beans. The smell of fast food mixed with jet fuel and cleaning supplies created that uniquely airport atmosphere that somehow made everyone feel slightly displaced, slightly anxious, slightly eager to be somewhere else. Business as usual for everyone, except the 5 men in uniform walking slowly toward the main concourse. That's when everything started to change. It began with a businessman near the currency exchange who glanced up from his phone, did a double take, and quietly stepped aside. His expression shifted from typical traveller annoyance to something deeper. Recognition, maybe. Or just the instinctive understanding that he was seeing something significant. Then a mother with 2 young children noticed the flag-draped casket and instinctively reached for her kids, pulling them closer, not out of fear, but out of something deeper. Respect, maybe. Or just the recognition that they were witnessing something important. The little boy, maybe 7 years old, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mum, why are the soldiers walking so slowly?" "Because they're carrying someone very special," she whispered back, her voice thick with sudden emotion. "Someone who can't walk anymore." Word spread without words. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. A gate agent stepped out from behind her desk, her hand instinctively moving to her heart. An elderly man in a veteran's cap removed it entirely, holding it against his chest as he stood straighter than he probably had in years. Even the coffee machine seemed to quiet down as the honor guard made their way across the polished terminal floor, their boots marking time in a rhythm as old as military tradition itself. Hart kept his eyes forward, focused on the far end of the concourse where he could see Major Mallory waiting. The older man stood in full-dress uniform near Gate 38, his silver hair perfectly groomed, his chest, heavy with ribbons, earned over 3 decades of service. He wasn't crying. Soldiers like Alan Mallory didn't cry in public. But Hart could see the weight in his shoulders, the way his hands stayed clasped behind his back, like he was holding himself together through sheer force of will. They were halfway across the terminal when the first obstacle appeared. Malcolm Trent looked exactly like what Central Casting would order if they needed someone to play officious airport supervisor. Mid-40s, slightly hunched from too many years leaning over desks, clutching a tablet like his life depended on it. The blue lanyard around his neck read Terminal Supervisor, and everything about his body language screamed that he was having the kind of day where every small problem felt like a personal attack. Hart saw him coming from 50 yards away. The way the man's stride picked up pace, the determined set of his jaw, the way he was already shaking his head before he'd even reached them. This wasn't going to go smoothly. "Excuse me," Trent called out, stepping directly into their path. "I'm going to need you gentlemen to halt right there." The honor guard came to a stop with the kind of precision that would make a drill instructor weep with joy. Not sudden, not jarring, just a perfectly coordinated pause that kept the casket level while making it absolutely clear that they'd stopped by choice. Not because they'd been forced to. Hart's eyes met Trent's, and for a moment neither man spoke. Around them, the terminal seemed to hold its breath. Passengers who'd been walking past now found reasons to slow down, to linger near shop windows, to suddenly need something from their carry-on bags. Everyone could sense the tension building. "I'm Malcolm Trent, Terminal Operations Supervisor," the man continued, tapping his tablet with the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing you're about to start a fight you're not sure you can win. "This procession isn't authorized to pass through this sector during peak civilian traffic. I'm going to need you to reroute through Service Hallway 3. Hart didn't immediately respond. In the military, silence was often the most powerful weapon you could deploy. Let the other guy fill the quiet with increasingly desperate justifications while you figured out exactly what you were dealing with. The RAF corporal at the rear of the formation cleared his throat diplomatically. "Sir, with respect, this escort was pre-approved through civilian liaison 2 days ago. All the paperwork should be in your system." Trent's fingers flew across his tablet screen. "Yes, well, that was before I got word about the Emirates flight deplaning early. We've got 300 passengers about to flood this concourse, and I can't afford bottlenecks. Nothing personal against your situation, but I've got efficiency metrics to meet." That last word, situation, hung in the air like a slap. Around them, Hart could hear the subtle shift in the crowd's mood. What had been polite curiosity was hardening into something else. A woman near the duty-free shop actually gasped. A teenager muttered something under his breath that sounded distinctly unflattering. Hart finally spoke, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from leading men in places where the wrong decision gets people killed. This soldier gave his life for this country. He will not be walked through a service corridor like cargo. Trent's face flushed. That's not what I meant. This procession, Hart continued, each word precise as a drill command, was cleared through proper channels with route timing and clearance codes. If you need verification, you're welcome to make those calls, but we will not be rerouting. The supervisor stepped closer, lowering his voice, but somehow managing to make it sound more threatening. Sergeant, I am the on-duty operations supervisor. That gives me real-time discretion to adjust for safety and efficiency concerns. I'm trying to avoid a disruption here. Hart looked at him for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was quiet enough that only Trent could hear it clearly. But somehow, everyone in the terminal seemed to lean in anyway. You are not the one carrying him. Those 7 words hit the air like a gavel. Final. Absolute. Not angry, not shouting. Just a simple statement of fact that somehow contained the weight of every promise ever made to a fallen soldier's family. Trent's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Behind him, Hart could see 2 security guards shifting uncomfortably, neither one looking particularly eager to enforce whatever their supervisor was about to demand. That's when the murmurs started. Disgraceful, someone whispered, loud enough to be heard. That's a hero they're carrying, added another voice. Bloody hell, let them through, came a third. This one with the unmistakable accent of someone who'd grown up respecting the men in red tunics. Trent looked around, suddenly aware that his audience was no longer neutral. Phones were coming out, but not to check flights or scroll through social media. People were recording. This was about to become very public, very quickly. Hart made the decision for him. With the same measured precision he'd used to march across the tarmac, Hart took a single step forward. Not aggressive, not threatening, just an absolutely unmistakable statement that the conversation was over and the procession was continuing. The other guards fell into step immediately, lifting the casket with practiced ease. Trent found himself stepping backward, his authority evaporating like morning mist, as 5 men in uniform simply walked past him with quiet dignity. But Trent wasn't finished. Hart could see it in the man's face, the desperate need to reassert control, to prove that his clipboard and lanyard still meant something in this increasingly chaotic situation. The supervisor grabbed his radio, muttering rapid instructions to someone on the other end. By the time the honor guard had advanced another 50 yards, Trent was back, flanked by 2 additional staff members and looking like a man who'd decided to make this the hill he died on. Sergeant Hart, he called out, using Hart's name for the first time, clearly having done some quick research. I'm giving you one final opportunity to reconsider. Service Corridor 3 is available. It's respectful, and it will get you to your destination without further incident. Hart didn't break stride, didn't even turn his head. The procession continued forward like an unstoppable force of nature. That's when Trent made his fatal mistake. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was ego. Maybe he genuinely thought he was doing the right thing. But as the honor guard approached his position, Malcolm Trent stepped directly in front of the casket and reached out his hand toward the Union Jack. Hart's response was instantaneous and precisely controlled. His right hand shot out, catching Trent's wrist mid-motion and stopping those grasping fingers just inches from the flag. Not violent, not angry, just absolutely, completely immovable. You do not touch that flag. The words cut through the terminal noise like a blade through silk. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Children stopped crying. Even the overhead announcements seemed to pause, as if the whole building was holding its breath. Hart's grip wasn't painful, but it was utterly final, like trying to move a mountain with your bare hands. Trent's face went white, then red, then white again as he realized exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. "This is completely inappropriate," Trent sputtered. but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. Hart's eyes never left his. "So was reaching for a casket you didn't earn the right to carry." Around them, the crowd had pressed closer, forming an informal circle of witnesses to something none of them had expected to see when they'd rolled out of bed that morning. Near the windows, Major Mallory stood watching, his expression unreadable, but his posture radiating quiet approval. Hart released Trent's wrist with deliberate slowness, the message crystal clear. "I could have held you there all day, but I'm choosing to let you go." The supervisor stumbled backward, his authority completely shattered, his tablet clutched against his chest like armor that had already proven useless. Without another word, Hart adjusted his grip on the casket and nodded to his fellow guards. The procession resumed its steady march toward Gate 38, leaving Trent standing alone in their wake, surrounded by passengers who were looking at him like he'd just tried to steal candy from a baby. As they reached Major Mallory's position, Hart felt something shift in the terminal atmosphere. What had started as routine civilian indifference had transformed into something deeper, recognition maybe, or just the understanding that they'd witnessed something important, something real. The older soldier stepped forward as the honor guard brought his son's casket to a gentle stop. No words were exchanged between Hart and Alan Mallory. Soldiers of their generation and experience didn't need words for moments like this. Just a slight nod from the major, a barely perceptible inclination of Hart's head in response, and the understanding that a promise made 20 years ago had finally been kept. As Hart and the other guards stepped back to give the family their moment, he caught sight of Trent still standing at the edge of the concourse. The supervisor looked smaller somehow, diminished by his encounter with something he hadn't understood but couldn't ignore. His clipboard hung forgotten at his side, his earlier urgency replaced by what might have been the beginnings of shame. Near the gate windows, passengers continued to watch in respectful silence. A little girl in a school uniform raised her hand in a tiny salute, mimicking something she'd probably seen in movies. Her grandfather, wearing a Royal British Legion pin on his jacket, placed his hand over his heart and kept it there until the ceremony was complete. No one applauded, no one cheered. But the silence was full of meaning, the kind of quiet that comes when strangers recognize they're witnessing something larger than themselves, something that connects them to traditions and sacrifices they might never fully understand but instinctively respect. Hart stood at attention with the other guards as Major Mallory placed his hands on his son's casket for the final time before the hearse would carry Captain Rhys Mallory on the last leg of his journey home. The old soldier's shoulders were straight, his bearing perfect, but Hart could see the tremor in his gloved hands, the way his breathing had become carefully controlled. This was what duty looked like, when the cameras weren't rolling and the headlines weren't being written. This was what service meant, when it was stripped of politics and pageantry and reduced to its essential truth. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things because someone needs to and because they'd promised they would. As the family said their goodbyes and the funeral director began the arrangements for the final transfer, Hart caught Trent's eye one last time across the terminal. The supervisor looked like he wanted to say something, maybe an apology, maybe just an acknowledgement of what he'd learned. But the moment stretched too long, and whatever words he might have found stayed locked inside. Instead, Trent simply stepped back further into the crowd, his earlier authority replaced by the kind of quiet that comes when you realize you've been part of something bigger than your job description, something that will stick with you long after your shift ends and your clipboard goes back in the drawer. The Honor Guard's mission was complete, but Hart knew the real work was just beginning. Tomorrow there would be another young soldier standing guard at Buckingham Palace, enduring the jokes and the photos and the occasional disrespect from tourists who saw only the uniform, not the person inside it. There would be another family somewhere saying goodbye to someone who wouldn't be coming home. And there would be another promise made, in the quiet moments between soldiers, the kind of promise that might not be called in for years, but would be honoured when the time came. That's what service really meant. Not the ceremonies or the medals or the parades, but the quiet commitments made in the dark, the promises kept when no one was watching, the willingness to stand between the world and the worst it could offer, even when that stand was nothing more dramatic than walking slowly through an airport terminal, carrying someone home. As Hart and the other guards prepared to leave, several passengers approached to shake hands or offer quiet words of thanks. An elderly woman pressed a tissue into Hart's hand, her eyes bright with tears. A young father lifted his son to get a better look at the real soldier, whispering explanations about bravery and sacrifice and what it meant to serve something bigger than yourself. Hart accepted their gratitude with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout the day. Not because he was seeking praise, but because he understood that these moments of connection were part of the mission too. Every person who stopped to watch, every child who raised their hand in an impromptu salute, every stranger who put their phone away and stood in respectful silence, was learning something about what service looked like when it really mattered. Outside Terminal 3, the London sky had darkened with approaching evening, but Hart felt lighter than he had in weeks. Not because the duty was finished, duty never really finished, but because he'd kept faith with something important. He'd honoured a promise, respected a tradition, and maybe taught a few people something about what those red tunics really represented. As the hearse pulled away carrying Captain Rhys Mallory toward his final rest, Hart stood at attention one last time, his salute sharp and precise in the gathering dusk. Tomorrow he'd be back at his post, standing guard over ceremonies and traditions that some people would never understand. But today, for just a few hours in a busy airport terminal, those traditions had shown their true power, not as tourist attractions or photo opportunities, but as living expressions of values that bind communities together and remind us all of what we owe to those who serve. The question isn't whether Malcolm Trent learned anything from his encounter with real authority that day. The question is what you would have done in his position. Would you have stepped aside to honour the procession, or would you have insisted on following procedure regardless of the circumstances? And more importantly, do you think most people truly understand what it means when a royal guard takes off his bearskin cap and picks up a rifle, trading ceremony for combat, trading parades for the kind of service that sometimes doesn't come with a journey home? If this story reminded you that the men and women in uniform are more than just tourist attractions, hit that like button and show your support for those who serve without fanfare, without applause, and often without the recognition they deserve. Subscribe and ring that notification bell. We share new Royal Guard stories every single day, stories that reveal the real people behind the ceremonial traditions. And if you know someone who still thinks these guards are just for show, share this video with them. Let them see what happens when tradition meets bureaucracy, when respect confronts indifference, and when one soldier's promise to another creates a moment that changes everyone who witnesses it. Check out our other Royal Guard stories appearing on your screen now, each one a reminder that real authority doesn't come from clipboards and lanyards, but from character forged in service and promises kept even when no one is watching. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, with another story that proves the Queen's Guards are so much more than the tourists who try to make them smile could ever imagine.